Welcome, everyone. For those of you who have just joined us, we've had a very full and wonderful and productive day discussing various themes on religious norms in the public sphere, the challenge. I'm Munir Jiwa. I direct the Center for Islamic Studies here at the Graduate Theological Union. And I want to just first thank all of you and to our sponsors for this program, the Center on Institutions and Governance, of course, the Center for Islamic Studies at the GTU I just mentioned, partner university funds, and the Social Science Research Council. And again, to my colleagues, Hedi Riss and John and all the volunteers, I also want to extend a very warm thank you for all your work. And also to Sampur Furzane at the Center for Islamic Studies. I have the honor and privilege and pleasure of introducing Professor Musa today. He is a professor of religion and Islamic studies in the Department of Religion at Duke University, and he has a whole range of interests, but spanning both modern and classical Islamic thought in the areas of law, theology, history, and ethics. He is the author of Ghazali, the Poetics of Imagination, offering a reading of the ideas of the 12th century polymath al-Ghazali, and a work that was awarded the 2006 award from the American Academy of Religion Prize for the best first book in the history of religions. Recently, he has co-published an edited volume called Muslim Family Law in Sub-Saharan Africa, Colonial Legacies and Post-Colonial Challenges. He has also edited the last manuscript of the late Professor Fazlur Rahman, Revival and Reform in Islam, a Study of Islamic Fundamentalism by One World. He is a Carnegie Scholar, and with that research and scholar, he's working on a book, and we'll hear some of that tonight, called What is a Madrasa? And this is a reflection on the state of religious education in a post-9/11 world, a writing that is also blended by his own 6 years spent in Madrasa in India. Another book, he's got, I think, several book projects in the making and imminent. Another book that deals with Muslim ethics called Between Right and Wrong, Debating Muslim Ethics, is under preparation. For all of us who know him well, he contributes frequently to various media outlets and op-ed pieces, New York Times, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, The Straits Times in Malaysia, The Star in Johannesburg, which he's a native of South Africa, and he provides commentary to all these sort of public radio, national public radio, and has got his own blog called Dihli's, the kind of in-between spaces, and his own website, ibrahimmusa.com. I just want to read a little excerpt before inviting Professor Musa to the podium. Of his time spent in the madrasa, he says, I remain a critic of madrasa education, its inability to provide the big picture of Islamic ideas, its failure to effect the transformation of Muslim societies. Yet, madrasas offer something of enormous value. Properly harnessed, they are the repositories of classical learning and seed intellectual sophistication that might challenge the shallow discourses of fundamentalism and revivalism that so often passes as Islam today. Madrasas are environments of Islamic cultivation of the self, culture, civility, wisdom, and life. So without further ado, Professor Musa to speak on norms in the Madrasa sphere between tradition, scripture, and the public good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Munir, for that kind introduction. And first of all, let me thank Hedi Riss, Professor Olivier Roy, and also Munir for making it possible for me to come here and for inviting me to participate with you. And thank you very much. I enjoyed the day. I know that I stand between you and your dinner, and you've had a long day, so I hope not to burden you too much, but hopefully keep it as conversational as possible. The idea of norms in the Madrasa Sphere, I call it the Madrasa Sphere, and I really want to give some kind of reflection on the question of tradition, scripture, and the public good. And I think one of the key words I want to introduce here is that it's important to get a grasp of the madrasa narrative in itself in order to understand one thread of Muslim traditionalists. One might not agree with them, but to remain ignorant of their narrative is to intentionally misunderstand them and also fail to grasp the complex discursive horizons in which they overlap and differ with other intellectual horizons in the Muslim world, contemporary Muslim world, like the Muslim modernists or the Muslim revivalists or the Salafis and the Sufis and so on. So I think it's important to understand the traditionalist narrative. And the traditionalist narrative I'm going to talk about is something that most people in the Western policy circles and academia possibly heard the term madrasa or Deoband or Deobandi for the first time in the wake of the post-9/11 world. In that context, keywords like Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and madrasas became the terms for the media's rhetorical diet. And educated members of the public correctly associated the Deobandi movement with the madrasas of South Asia, a network of seminaries that are often treated with dread since they are yoked to Western security interests in South Asia. In this presentation, I will look at some of the normative practices of the Deoband school, a representative sample of issues to illustrate how religious norms and the public good are advanced within madrasa networks. Let me say something briefly against this institution called Deoband. So, in 1867, in the aftermath of the Indian rebellion against the British, a number of rural elites, rural religious elites rather, decided that they wanted to establish a school. They were already for a century and a half, 1.5 century, intellectual tradition based out of Lucknow, serving Muslim India, but also many other madrasas. But a new idea of a madrasa emerged at the hands of a group of people. Two of them had studied in the British education system in Delhi College, a man by the name of Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi and Rashid Ahmed Gangohi. And they decided that they're going to establish the school in this town, Qasbah of northern India called Deoband, which is about 100 miles from the Indian capital called Delhi. And their purpose for this was, one, that they wanted to preserve Islam as the religious tradition from what they saw as the onslaught of British colonialism and Western culture. Because they knew the die was cast, the Mughals are out of the picture, there needs to be some kind of preservation work to be done in order to preserve any kind of Muslim interest. And they thought they are going to preserve Muslim religious interests. So they established that school, and it's very interesting to look at the constitution of the school. The idea of the school is that this institution shall always just take money from the Muslim community and never take any money from any government. That was very interesting that they wanted this to be a community venture. The other thing that they wanted to do was that they wanted to preserve a version of Islam that is very different from their nemesis, known as the Ahlul Hadith, the people who study only Hadith texts, and broadly we can call them the Salafis, and their particular approach. In other words, they wanted to preserve the canonical interpretation of Islam historically, and theirs was the Hanafi, Ash'ari, Maturidi. Ash'ari, Maturidi are the kind of theological doctrines, and the Hanafi law school, that was their interest. They also tried to understand themselves as a continuation of a tradition that goes back earlier of a man called Ahmad Sirhindi, who was a key player during the time of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, and they want to pursue his tradition, but more after that, a man that dies in 1762, a man known as Shah Waliullah of Delhi, that they want to preserve his intellectual tradition as part of their heritage. And that tradition of both those individuals that they mention are basically a rich metaphysical intelligibility of Islamic Sufism. So Islamic Sufism with a very rich discursive tradition attached to it, in which you can understand the metaphysics of how Sufism relates to the world and also to the development of the inner self. Now, of course, the Deobandis are not the only players on the Indo-Pakistan scene. They have their rivals in the form of the Barelvi school, which a thumbnail sketch would mean that this Barelvi school and the Deobandis disagree on a particular understanding of the conception of Muhammad as a prophet and his cosmic role, and that's where the Deobandis and the Barelvis disagree. And if you ask me a question afterwards, I can elaborate on that. They disagree with the Ahlul Hadith. The Ahlul Hadith basically completely neglect and ignore the intermediate tradition after the Prophet Muhammad and only want the first and second, possibly the third generation after Muhammad to be the authoritative reference point for Islamic teaching, so they disagree with that. Of course, there's also in India 12 Shiite traditions. There's the Dawoodi Bohras, there are the Nizari Shias, a range of those. I cannot talk all about them. I want to focus on this group because this group has a particular way in which it articulates itself and talks about tradition, and also it is fairly, even though it is the minority in terms of Sunni Islam on the subcontinent, because the Barelvis are basically the populace, because they're the people that support shrine practices, going to shrines and going to having kind of popular religious festivals, or at least the Barelvis tolerate that. The Deobandis being more austere, despite that fact, the Deoband school has a great national and international presence for several reasons. That part of, in the beginning of the 20th century, some people belonging to a great Islamic evangelical movement that begins in India, known as the Tabligh movement, attaches itself and identifies itself with the Deobandi tradition. And the Tabligh movement has a global presence. It's one of those movements that has no P.O. box. There's no post office box for the Tabligh movement. But you can have a presence of that movement on a global scale. One of the most extraordinary understudied kind of Islamic social movements, not social movement, but the religious evangelical movement. And because of that, Deoband got a big shot in the arm. The formation of Pakistan, Bangladesh, of course, Deoband has presence there. Amongst the madrasa network, Deobandi madrasas proliferate more than any of the others, and that's because of their global network, foreign revenues, especially from people settled in the UK, in Southern Africa, in the Caribbean, that managed to supply, but also Indian merchant capital from the big cities of Calcutta, Mumbai, South India, that provides the background for that. Now, the key idea that I want to introduce is that less well known, that far from being a political movement or a militant group or a network of madrasas, even though Deoband manifests itself in the form of a network, Deoband sees itself as first and foremost as an ethical and moral franchise. It's an ethical and moral franchise that advocates a specific nomos, what they call a maslak, from among a variety of traditional blends of Islam. So while there are a variety of traditional blends of Islam, they believe that their blend and their version, or their kind of constellation of how they put together their nomos, and I'll speak a little bit more about that, their maslak is their kind of identifying vocabulary. So if you have to identify what is Deoband, you need to identify what are the elements of their maslak, their nomos. Now, the quick thing is that why Deoband became so popular post 9/11, because Mullah Omar and some of the religious clerics in the Taliban movement, all the people in the Taliban movement are not clerics, but Mullah Omar and some of the senior people were affiliated to the Deoband franchise as it plays out in Pakistan. Mullah Omar studied at a madrasa, a Deobandi madrasa, hence Deoband gets connected to that. But as I said, it's highly varied within, but it does have elements that keeps it together. I use the term nomos, made famous by Robert Cover, an American juridical and ethical, American juridical and ethical circles, as a useful provisional translation of maslak. Maslak as a nomos is the normative universe that people inhabit. More important than rules, more important than principles of justice, more important than formal institutions, are the narratives that locate and give meaning to the law. So basically, nomos for Cover, and if you read the Deobandi story correctly, it's a set of narratives that drives this project. What are the stories behind it? So maslak provides the narrative that describes, shapes, and regulates the normative universe of adherents who adhere to traditional Islamic thought. In Cover's words, quote, law and narrative are inseparably related. To continue, every prescription is insistent in its demand to be located in discourse, to be supplied with history and destiny, beginning and end, explanation and purpose. And I couldn't find a better description for what maslak means, and I repeat, every prescription is insistent in its demand to be located in a discourse, to be supplied with history and destiny, beginning and end, explanation and purpose, end of quote. And in Cover's view, the force of interpretive commitments holds the normative universe together. And drawing on Cover's understanding of nomos, I work with a more, and therefore it's a more lucid category in order to deepen our understanding of the Deobandi maslak. What has intrigued me in my exploration of representative samples of the Deobandi ethical discourse is their sustained commitment to key elements of their maslak, which often involves a critique of their adversaries. There's always a critique of the adversary. And therefore, I will use the word maslak, nomos, and nomosphere interchangeably. But often the critique and the diatribes that they use, and when they talk about, they often talk about the subversive ability of westernization to undermine age-old Islamic norms and values. Yet when it comes to the implementation of a range of practices inspired by Western science, technology, and economic practices, from organ transplantation, brain death, to women's issues and Islamic banking, one finds among the rulings of these very same South Asian ulama a surprising justification to endorse these modern practices in terms of an Islamic nomos, an accommodation. In other words, there is a rhetoric of resistance, but a practice of accommodation in one way or the other. But that accommodation happens according to a particular narrative. And it's that narrative that we must get hold of in order to understand how they justify it. It's a long traditional narrative. In other words, the pragmatic outcome in Deobandi ethical deliberation is striking. Surely what is evident is an accommodation of changing social norms, but at a very different pace. In order to show how tradition, scripture, and public good is constructed within the Madrasa Sphere, let me introduce you to one key thinker among the Deoband school and the way he imagines and then later exfoliates his concept of tradition. And note that tradition is not only a thought style, and here I am using Ludwig Fleck, that tradition has a thought style, but also it is also a mode of living. This figure that I want to introduce you is a man called Qari Muhammad Tayyib, who died in 1983. He was a former principal of the Darul Uloom, this major, and the Deoband school is the mother school of the Deobandi network, right? The one in India. Not the one in Pakistan. Pakistan gets the kind of the radii that comes out of what is today India. Unless one were in the thicket of the madrasa world of the Indo-Pak subcontinent, Tayyib's name would not mean much. Yet by all accounts, he was a paragon of traditional piety and learning of the Indian Hanafi tradition, Deobandi tradition. And in post-partition India, he assumed a role of pontifical solemnity during a 5-decade stewardship as principal of the famous Deoband seminary. And he's also related to, he's a grandson of the founder, I won't go into that. Now, in 2 works of Tayyib that I draw on, one is called Independent Reasoning and Authority, Ijtihad or Taqleed, written sometime in the late 60s or even early 70s, and another text of his that both are written in Urdu become my sources, and the second text is The Religious Orientation and Ethical, that is the nomothetic temperament of the ulama of Deoband. And that text is a very, very revealing text. Now, one of the things that Tayyib does is that he argues that all new events, contingencies, and challenges requires a systematic taxonomy in order for one to reach what constituted the universal. So this is kind of Aristotelian method involved here. And he made the point to state that human beings were distinguished as thinking beings, a distinction that elevated humans from all other animals. And the key word that he wants us to share and understand with him is perception and understanding forms the centerpiece of his hermeneutic. And understanding means the Arabic word fiqh for understanding, which is also the word that is used for Islamic law for the norm-making or norm discovery process in Muslim thought. And for Tayyib, and here he draws on Ghazali, understanding of fiqh was linked to the heart, to the pectoral region of the body. It's this relationship, not only the mind, but is rather through affect and the inner understanding. In other words, for Tayyib, understanding was not merely discursive, but it was the discursive tradition tied to human subjectivity and the inner needs of the human being. And therefore, this importance of the zahir, the external, and the batin, the inner, it's very, very important in this hermeneutic of the Deobandi tradition. Now, Tayyib does encounter and does deal with a notion, thank you very much, of the idea of the renovation of Islamic thought. And in his view, that any kind of engagement with Islamic thought, any kind of renovation of Islamic thought for that matter, must point in the direction of what he called prophetic pedagogy. Prophetic pedagogy is at the centerpiece of this, what he calls minhaj-e-nabuwwat. Just as the Prophet Muhammad inaugurated a whole new mode and way of thinking at the inception of Islam, similarly, it was only by adhering to the same prophetic model that one could attempt refashioning Islamic thought. The prophetic model made perfect moderation and balance the cornerstone of Islamic teachings. Moderation and balance. This is the key word. And you might see that recently in Egypt and those places, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, for instance, talking about wasatiyya, middle of the road, this kind of moderation. So kinds of traditionalism have a lot of things in common too, although Qaradawi's one would differ in some crucial ways from the Deobandi version. And Tayyib then argues that once one had mastered and grasped the prophetic pedagogy, then it was possible to articulate Islamic thought in a whole new format, he said. But if one dared step away an inch from the prophetic model, the project was bound to be doomed. In that case, calls for renewal of Islamic thought will fail and result in disfiguring Islamic teachings. And he says that the only thing required today is this. Based on an understanding of the prophetic methodology, there is a need to formulate in the idiom and style of the day a new projection and appropriation of Islamic thought. Only through this approach, it is still in his words, can one truly renovate Islamic thought. However, if we depart from the prophetic pedagogy in renovation and forsake its tradition-based wisdom, then the result would be to alter Islamic thought and subvert the entire process. Renovation of thought can be summarized in two brief phrases, he says. Our questions or topics, our masail, should be ancient, but our arguments should be new. Only by pursuing renewal in this manner can we fulfill the responsibility of divine stewardship, khilafat-e-ilahi, and the delegation of prophecy, end of quote. Now, this nomos or maslak is not fully comprehensible unless one digs a little deeper into what he means by prophetic pedagogy. In brief, the elements of a maslak involves several sub-narratives that constitute the overall compelling story or narrative. Remember, I told you that the key word behind and why I like nomos, it's a story. First, the nomos involves a historical narrative. How Islam originated and how this version that is received by the Deobandi tradition is the most correct one. So the historical narrative navigates Islam's early kind of sectarian milieu, all these divisions, and how this story is the balanced story, the key story, and hence the correct story. Second, it involves a pedagogy of the self. The formation of the madrasa student is absolutely crucial. The spiritual formation, as well as the pedagogical or the kind of ethical formation of the madrasa student, is absolutely crucial to the Deobandi nomosphere. The latter point is possibly the important point of the pedagogy, and the indispensable role of apprenticeship between student and teacher. In this sense, it resembles the Sufi relationship between master and disciple. For the Deobandis, this apprenticeship is absolutely crucial. They call it sohbat. Without this apprenticeship, you cannot be a Deobandi. Without this apprenticeship with the teacher and this relationship, there is no Deobandi story. Like the Prophet Muhammad had companions who imparted his teachings and knowledge to the successor generation, so every generation must have access to a living person and a community who mediates the teachings of Islam. And so therefore, this lived community that the Deobandis want to create, in many ways you can say that your relationship with your teacher is a relationship that is even more profound, more significant than biological relationships. So the teacher-student relationship is a certain kind of relationship that transcends kinship, and to create an intellectual community that is more sacred than even a biological community. And so therefore Tayyib, for instance, would argue that in the classical tradition, when people talk about Abu Hanifa and his students, they call it Ashabu Abu Hanifa, the companions of Abu Hanifa. They don't say Muhammad al-Shaybani or Abu Yusuf. They are known by their first names, but the more exact and the more valued attribution is to the master founder. And so in many ways, this relationship between teacher-student goes beyond the affective relationship, but also on the formation of a scholarly community, a set of epistemic kinships, an epistemic DNA that are viewed as more intimate and sacred than family or biology. And here the other thing that develops in this relationship between student-teacher is reverence for the teacher. This is what I always tell my students, reverence for the teacher. I teach them what the Deobandi method is, of course. I don't demand that from them. But if they want to, of course. That reverential relationship is absolutely crucial to the transmission of both the integrity of the tradition and, as a consequence, the correct understanding of the tradition. And so here Tayyib, for instance, in his writings, is absolutely bruising, for instance, in his criticism of those who commit themselves to books only, and who only read books. And he would say, what do you have? You only have black lines on a book. What's that? You can read all kinds of books, but if you don't have the relationship between the teacher who can perform the book for you, and so the teacher is the role of an exemplar who performs the book for you, and actually it goes into a very, very wonderful kind of moment of eloquence in his book. And I wish Charles Hirschkin was here, because he writes a book on ethical soundscapes, because here Tayyib talks about the question of tone, the various registers in which you must hear what the teacher is saying. The teacher brings mostly, all of them are his. There are women's madrasas, but we can talk about that in a slightly during question and answer session. But he's basically talking about the men's madrasas, that these teachers, through their experience and through their connection to the tradition, can actually perform the books and the tradition in ways that you can hear sounds and soundscapes in ways that you mightn't have heard. Now, then he goes into a whole detailed kind of discussion, what he calls the key elements that must go into the formation, that one should understand the kind of universal maxims, what he calls the qawaid kulliyah, and the precepts, the dawabit, that underlie the teachings of Islam, that you must have those maxims and those kind of universals under control. And therefore, he would say that once you can grasp those principles, and I'll explain that in a minute what those principles are, he says, to be a Deobandi is to combine, if you want to articulate a nomos, in which the comprehensive interpretive principles are blended with personal intellectual mentorship and apprenticeship with the teacher. So, to have a grasp of these universal operating principles of the tradition, and also your apprenticeship with your master. And some of these principles that he talks about, he makes a list of something, what I would call, say, some 31 of these aphorisms or maxims. And some of them are that, for instance, among the maxims are, there is no Islam except in community. Another maxim, there is no monasticism in Islam. Another principle, people should not be compelled to accept a religion. Another one, we do not discriminate among any of God's prophets. Do not harm is another one, nor retaliate with harm. And these next two are very interesting. All believers are a brotherhood. And I guess they meant to include women too, but they used ikhwa, right? And all of humanity is a single brotherhood. All of humanity is a single brotherhood, which is quite interesting of the kind of humanistic thrust that there is there. Another maxim is, and this will be the last one, whoever takes a life without justification is as if he had killed all of humanity, among the many maxims. And so, for Tayyib, there is a kind of a checklist by which he wants to operate. Now, when Tayyib deals with kind of the key issues, one must understand that very pivotal to this nomos are the two issues about teacher-student relationship and those kind of universal maxims that you must comprehend and fully embody as well as implement in your interpretive framework. He does also create different zones of interhuman transaction, which is known as mu'amalat, or social intercourse, mu'ashara, political and social life. He lays that out. These spheres of life, overtly, he believes, to which spheres of life? The zone of interhuman transaction, social intercourse, political and social life, siyasa, these zones overtly carry the imprint of their times, and those zones are mutable. They always alter. In these spheres, he rationalized the Sharia provide an abundance of general principles and a paucity of specific applications. So there are general principles, and these general principles would be his universal maxims, and very few specific applications. In fact, he argued that the Sharia mindset itself anticipated that the particular applications designed to serve the specific spheres of interhuman transactions, politics and social life, were time sensitive, and therefore they were designed to change according to the vicissitudes of time. Now the key issue for Tayyib here is that who can do this? No one can do this work of dealing with these new contingencies unless you are someone embodied in the tradition and you encapsulate this kind of teaching structure, this kind of pedagogy, and embody that kind of pedagogy and those universal maxims. If you go any other route, if you go, say, the Jamaat-e-Islami route, the Muslim Brotherhood route, or the Ahl Hadith route, that do not give any kind of integrity to this, in his view, that would not be a renovation, but that would be a complete abomination. And for him here, what is important is the character and the capacity of the persons embarking on the project of reformulation of Islamic thought. Two qualifications for the person about to embark on reformulation or doing reform. They must possess the intellectual excellence and embody a commitment to practice. You must embody, just cannot only have a theoretical commitment, but you must embody a commitment to practice. The most important initiative, he pointed out, was the selection of the persons of action, the people who do act, who were visionary in matters of religion and occupied a status of wisdom and insight by grasping the primary and secondary aspects fully while embodying the true spirit of Islam. And he continues, they should behold the practical wisdom dispensed by God for which the formulation of this religion came into existence. Now, this is the kind of general kind of overview of the Deobandi Maslak. I want to give you just two examples, and if I have time for three examples briefly, of how they get applied. And I want to show you some kind of variation. So, the first story the first instance goes to South Africa. In the 1960s, Tayyib undertakes a trip to South Africa, where I'm from, as you heard when I was introduced. And in the 1960s, the South African Muslim community was surprised by a fatwa on the subject of bank interest, described as riba, usury, that was prohibited by the Quran and the Sharia. So Tayyib came in 1964, and a businessman in South Africa, a man by the name of Ayub Mullah, asked him what is his view on the question of Muslims are a minority in South Africa, what is the ruling regarding bank interest? Tayyib then said, well, I will take this ruling to the Darul Ifta, which is the office of fatwas at my college, at Deoband, and we will send you an answer. Now, quite interesting, a year later, the fatwa arrived in South Africa. More important than the fatwa is the kind of response that this fatwa gets from South African Deobandis, and that's a crucial thing. Now, let me quickly just give you some background, that in the ancient Hanafi authorities, to which the Tayyib school abides by, and many of not all the Muslims in South Africa also follow the Hanafi school. According to the Hanafi law school, one of the 4 Sunni canonical law schools, that law school permits interest or usury-bearing transactions to take place between Muslims and non-Muslims in a territory known as, in terms of classical Islamic constitutional jurisprudence, the Darul Harb. Darul Harb basically is those territories with which Muslims do not have a treaty. So where Muslims have established themselves politically, they have political suzerainty, that is known as Darul Islam. All those territories with which they have not signed a treaty, that means there's a state of unspoken hostility. Therefore, literally Darul Harb means the abode of hostility or the abode of war. So the Hanafi law says that in those kind of territories where Muslims do not have suzerainty, where they do not have treaties, in those areas, Muslim merchants go there, they can engage in interest-bearing transactions. So the Deobandi muftis, the people who gave the fatwa, basically had this to say. If the position in the Republic of South Africa is similar to that of a Darul Harb, that is a abode of hostility according to classical Islamic law, then the classification of that country as a Darul Harb and the application of rulings with regard to dealings in interest between Muslims and non-Muslims would also be applicable. According to your statement, the fatwa continues, Muslims are in a very small minority in the Republic of South Africa, and this proves that non-Muslims are in the overwhelming and ruling majority. This indeed is the only basis for classifying it as a Darul Harb. Now, what happens is that mild outrage and consternation possibly best characterizes the response of the South African Muslim religious leadership, and particularly the Deobandi school by the mufti of the one sector of the Deobandi is basically strongly dissented from this Indian fatwa. And Mufti Ibrahim Sanjalvi, speaking on behalf of his ulama group, said that he doubted whether South Africa could be neatly classified as a Darul Harb. While there were some features that suggested South Africa resembled an abode of hostility, there were other characteristics that suggested that it was an abode of safety, a Darul Aman. South Africa, in Mufti Sanjalvi's view, was a liminal space, or rather an intermediate territorial jurisdiction in terms of classical Islamic law. So there's Deobandi speaks back to Deobandi, right? But another way. And the way in which Deoband school and the South African version of the Deoband school then talks back is to basically argue that this ruling on the prohibition of interest is premised on Quranic teachings, and therefore it supersedes and overrides any kind of canonical interpretation. And basically says that the muftis in Deoband misread the political context of South Africa. South Africa cannot be categorized as such as a Darul Harb. South Africa has a different kind of juridical status in terms of classical Islamic law, which is a Darul Aman. Muslims have safety there even though they are a minority. And the Quranic scriptural imprimaturs override the canonical imprimaturs. Here you begin to see something that nowadays have become kind of fairly visible in Deobandi circles, is that slowly the canonical tradition is now being sung side by side with the scriptural tradition. So now the kind of thing that the Deobandis historically criticize the Ahlul Hadith for, that they go straight to Quran and Hadith and they ignore the intermediate tradition, they're taking a little bit out of that playbook. A little bit, but not very hard, because they still try to square up the canonical tradition with the scriptural playbook. They try to square it up, but you're beginning to see that as an emerging trend, and that is one of the things that I've seen emerge. And in that way, South African Deobandis have been able to push back and maintain that position of not, at least normatively, not accepting in Muslim practice in South Africa interest-bearing transaction. And as you might know, that South Africa has had two major Islamic banks recognized by the apartheid government. Also, one folded, as many of the Islamic banks do fold, and others is thriving. And many of the established kind of insurance companies, and many of them have also created a major kind of Islamic Sharia-compliant industry for Sharia in South Africa. My second example comes from India. In the summer of 2005, a heated controversy held Muslim India in a spell of confusion. A a section of India's kind of religious leadership were caught on the horns of their dilemma. They could either yield to the authority of tradition by honoring a traditional Islamic legal edict related to sexuality, or they could alter the rule in the light of new realities. What is the story? Story is a woman by the name of Imrana, a mother of 5, living near the city of Muzaffarnagar in the state of Uttar Pradesh, claimed that she was raped. The rapist was none other than her father-in-law, she claimed. Little is known about the context, but the details are not going to really impact what I want to say in what follows. Now, unless the woman in question lacked all her sensibilities, making such a claim was no small matter, with devastating consequences for her standing in society, where a woman's honor is linked to her husband's social standing, in this case from the kind of environment she comes from, and also what impact this would have for her marriage. Tragically, it was not the alleged crime that gained saturated media coverage. Rather, it was a decision by a Muslim cleric, a member of the ulama, a junior mufti at Deoband, that provoked outrage. This jurisconsult basically said that Imrana was no longer married to her lawful husband. Rape happens, she's no longer married to her. How does that happen? In terms of the tradition, the Islamic legal tradition, any offspring, male or female, could never lawfully marry nor remain married to someone with whom any one of one's parents had sexual intercourse. So if you had sexual intercourse with somebody, you cannot, the offspring or parent cannot marry that person. So in other words, some of the kind of, what's it called, the Bold and the Beautiful, an American soap operas where, Brooke has slept with, I don't know, whoever, the son, that could never happen, okay? That would not be acceptable. That violates all Sharia provision. That's a soap opera, many of you, they export this to the third world country, so I come from a third world country, therefore we watch it all the time, so I know the whole story. You might not watch it here, it's too respectable to show in America. So that's what happens, is that you cannot do this, and so therefore, because Imrana's husband's father had illicit sexual intercourse with her, her husband can no longer remain married to her because of the rules. Now, not all Muslim authorities enforce such metallic reasoning. For most early authorities in ethics, only a sexual encounter within a valid marriage, so if they were validly married to each other, right? If, Imrana, the husband's father was validly married to Imrana, then the son cannot marry her. A valid marriage. But anything outside wedlock cannot establish those barriers of consanguinity. So therefore, it would not be acceptable. But the Deoband school kept on pressing this position, and they kept on pushing the tradition of the Deobandi, of the Hanafi law school, and they were not mindful of that a rape had happened, and that their commitment to the tradition bordered on something like idolatry. And many right-thinking people found it scandalous that a woman's claim to have been raped did not even figure in the moral calculus of the ruling. Now, some other Muslim jurists did some hang gliding over the issue, but lost nerve at the last minute, failing to say explicitly that rape was fundamentally different to adultery and its accompanying concerns about the violation of consanguinity. So the Ahlul Hadith, Deoband's nemesis adversaries, who followed the plain meaning of the imprimaturs of the scriptural authority derived from the Quran and the prophetic tradition, they basically said that it was okay for Imrana to remain married to her husband, and that this violation that happened to her would not impact and affect that. The thing about the Deobandi response was, instead of reviewing the ethical and moral violation of Imrana in the light of the reality faced by women like her in India, the folks at the Deoband seminary found a scapegoat. They laid the blame for the fiasco at the feet of what they called sensationalist pro-Western media for blowing the matter out of proportion and distorting the facts. They also upbraided Muslim critics of their ruling, dismissing such figures as being faux reformers, pseudo-reformers, and unqualified to venture an opinion in religious matters. Even worse, they lambasted critics for possessing the gall and the temerity to challenge the authority of religious scholars. The Deoband scholars claimed Muslim critics who challenged their ruling were driven by malice, ignorance, and with a goal to earn cheap publicity. Now, thankfully, there were a few people on the Deobandi side, a few individuals that basically dissented from the major school and said what had happened was wrong, there's a question of rape, and that was the issue. The above incident provides a glimpse of what is at the center of the debate on Muslim ethics today. Male Muslim religious authorities are committed to implementing the canonical tradition of fiqh with integrity as an act of piety and religiosity. The question many people would ask is whether there can be fidelity to the tradition that does not result in what would by any account be a point that results in a miscarriage of justice and fairness to a victim. And when one listens to the story, that the way it plays out on this question of Imrana, one is reminded of what the moral theorist William Gass once wrote about. The American moral theorist once reminded us. Gass reflects on Tolstoy's caricatured but rationalist figure, Professor Katavasov, and described him as, quote, a man in love, not with particular men or women, not with things, but with principles, ideas, webs of reasoning, and if he rushes to the aid of his neighbor, it is not because he loves his neighbor, but because he loves God's law about it, end of quote. So, in many ways, this kind of application of the tradition in ways that you love God's law more than something else creates a problem in the dynamic of the tradition for the Deobandi tradition. Because I'm running out of time, let me sum up, and if we have time, we can answer some questions. What madrasa traditionalists invoke is an ontological and metaphysical otherness. It invokes another order, one that accepts the limits of reason and defers to the wisdom of God. If there is a retreat to the irrational and the archaic, then it is to reveal the limits of reason and the violence that reason imposes, especially when reason claims to make everything knowable and transparent. While the purpose of the Sharia are knowable, the acts of the Sharia, the purposes and forms of the practices are not always within the ken of reason. Yet, the madrasa tradition is deeply embedded in another kind of discourse of reason, a certain kind of embodied reasonableness. The primary function of norm making and norm derivation stems from this fiqh tradition, this kind of reasonableness. As a prominent figure of the Deoband school who died in the mid-20th century, Manazir Ahsan Gilani, explained, fiqh is discernment or appreciation of the tradition. So fiqh is to some extent a rational discipline, except that it is not a secular rationality, but is one that is imagined to be restricted and restrained by the limits of heteronomy and commitment to a theistic order. Fiqh creates a particular kind of legality and ethicality that attaches the body to the soul and connects practice to conscience. Sometimes, as in the Imrana case, fiqh turns into a brutal technical reason. Often such enforcement occurs with a thunderous theological authority validating the truth. But it can be challenged from the margins of these central traditions, as we saw in the case of South Africa or the minority rulings in the case of Imrana. Some of those who contest the mainstream Madrasa sphere would argue that when law and justice are in conflict, the rule must give way to higher reason, to justice, which is its primitive reason. One is loath to deprive individuals, communities, nations, and societies, for that matter, from their agency and harshly proclaim that they are victims of exploitative globalizing forces, as many critics are inclined to do. Domination and hegemony is, in my view, never total and complete. Individuals, communities, and societies devise overt and covert means of resisting even the most brutal attempts of deprivation. The point I wish to make is that Muslims, wherever they find themselves, are making choices on a daily basis about a range of activities, from the modes of their income, their choice of dress, as well as the ethical and moral decisions of a variety of kinds. Of course, their choices are not always autonomous ones. Obligations are foisted upon citizens of even the most liberal political states. Citizens and individuals are subject to rules, ordinances, and conventions that are made in the form of demands by the state, society, and community, in obvious and not so obvious ways. From simply acts of paying one's utility bills, obeying traffic laws, showing courtesy to neighbors and strangers, caring for parents, spouses, and pets, are all demonstrations that we are not entirely autonomous in our choices, no matter the protestations of radical libertarians. Autonomy is often partial. We respond to a variety of impulses, not all of them rational, in even our most basic decisions, even though most of the time we strive to reach reasonable and sensible outcomes. I thank you.
In the interest of time, I want to again thank Professor Musa, and we'll keep it very brief. Maybe we can accept 2 or 3 questions and then move on. Yes, please.
Professor Musa, thank you so much for your lecture. Very interesting and illuminative. I'd like to ask you a question. Going back to putting in Ayub and Hirschkin in conversation with each other and talking about social interaction. Wondering about when that pedagogy and the teacher-student relationship takes place over distance and space and through use of social media. So if a student and teacher are speaking through Skype, how does that change the conversation? And if we go outside the Islamic tradition and if one perceives the Dalai Lama to be one's spiritual guide and checks in with them on Twitter, how does that change the interaction of student-teacher relationship?
It makes him into a Twitter Lama. So it will be mullahs on the mainframe. Okay, so yeah, no, that's it. I thought about that. And someone did ask me that question, because nowadays what you're having long distance kind of mentorship, and long distance kind of through all this kind of social media. So how would that work? And in fact, there are, at least from the Middle Eastern countries, there are a whole number of traditional scholars who are actually instructing people long distance through Skype and through other kinds of social media. So there's already that network and that tradition. And I would say that again, I mean, I don't know how Deoband and the Deobandi tradition would react to that, but I would say that the kind of safest answer I would say to you is that some would say that, okay, that would work, it's second best, but the best would be to live in the same environment with your master, to have the kind of day-to-day inculcation to do that. Because remember, the critical part of this is that this relationship is one in which your reverence for the tradition and the sacrality and the respect for authority is very crucial, right? And that is the key part. So whether Skype can do that and whether you can switch on, switch off, how many hours are you going to spend with your teacher, whether it can do that, that's the kind of digital apprenticeship, what you're talking about, right? That's a digital apprenticeship, long-distance apprenticeship. I am reminded of Derrida talking about teleopoiesis, this kind of long-distance friendship that you have over time. But that is in terms of looking back, but that's an interesting thought. One of the issues that I talked about authority, which because of the interest of time, I had to cut short, is that whenever a kind of a new argument is made, all the kind of classical authorities are rehearsed, and they are re-argued and resituated. They are resituated in order to make a new hermeneutic. So basically, you can make a new argument, depending on how persuasive and convincing you are, provided that you rechannel the tradition. So you must always go and rechannel the tradition and repackage the tradition to make it speak. So for instance, there are ways in which, for instance, someone, for instance, could argue that the Prophet Muhammad, for instance, had a long-distance companion who he never saw, but he telepathically communicated with him, which is Uwais Qarni. Remember that? So there's the Uwaisi tradition of this kind of over time, over space, and so on. So that is quite interesting, that how you can repackage that, what kind of analog you can find, and how you can do that. Okay? Second question. I see a question in the back here.
You mentioned, if I understood correctly, a synthesis between the Ash'ari and Sufi, if I understood correctly, with the Deobandi. And I'm wondering if there's also a Platonic or a Neoplatonic strain, and if so, can you speak about it?
Thank you. The Deobandi school, in terms of law, Hanafi. In terms of its theological doctrine, commits itself to the Maturidi, a Central Asian school, and the Ash'ari too. So then they're respectful of the Ash'ari school, so those two instruct them. Well, one of the things that you need to understand is that the Deobandi tradition is saturated with Sufism. It's absolutely imperative. If you disown Tasawwuf, it is like disowning, because this whole master-student apprenticeship is the embodiment of a Sufi tradition in many ways, except that the Sufi master also works on your inner self, right? So all of them work on that tradition. So yes, many of the arguments and the debates that works on the metaphysical level in the Deobandi tradition and also in other South Asian traditions is of a Platonic nature. So for instance, this big chasm and disagreement that is between Deoband and his rival school, the Berkeley school, goes back to the 19th century. In the 19th century, a reformer connected to Shah Waliullah, that 18th century scholars, a man by the name of Ismail Shahid, Ismail the Martyr, who gets killed in Balakot in 1833. This guy, Ismail the Martyr, was the grandson of Waliullah. And he was a kind of a social reformer, and one of the things that he opposed were some of these practices that he thought were excess practices of Muslims not revering the Sharia and basically spending too much time in asking for intercession of saints, visiting shrines, and spending too much time on the kind of ecstatic dimensions of Islam. Now, doesn't mean that Ismail is not interested in ecstasy. It's just a different kind of ecstasy. So in his work, he's also proclaiming Ibn Arabi, who is big in the kind of Platonic ideal, right? But he's opposing others who believe that they are going too extreme in their commitment to the ecstatic, that the social suffers because of this ultra-ecstatic developments that are taking place in India. So he preaches against those, and then when he preaches against those, he makes this slip in the statement that he says, you know, there's no need to reverence Muhammad to the point of deification, because God is so powerful, if he wants, he can create 1,000,000 Muhammads. That immediately struck another chord who was opposed to him and said, that is heresy. Muhammad is exclusive. Muhammad actually has a kind of unique cosmic space, which is Platonic, and that perfect Platonic model. So Ismail had a combination of both Platonism and an Aristotelian kind of device working for him, that he can make those kind of statements because he's committed to divine omnipotence and omniscience in one way, but his opponents thought of it in another way, and that basically set the ground for this big chasm between the Deobandi and Berkeley, because the people that picked up that debate later on in late 19th, earlier 20th century, the man, Ahmad Raza Khan Berkeley, and Ahmad Raza Khan, he then basically says that the Deobandis are heretics because they insulted the Prophet. They have dogmatically insulted the Prophet, they are heretics, and therefore there's this chasm, and therefore it's an article of faith of the Berkeley's that your commitment to Muhammad must be different to that of the Deobandis. You must believe that Muhammad is the exclusive, kind of almost a kind of Christology, built into a Muhammadology, basically. But that is also, that's not new. It's also part of the tradition of the Nur Muhammadan light that's been central to Sufi traditions over time, but that became more accented in 19th century Indian thought and plays out in the 20th century in this kind of rivalry between Deobandi and Berkeley. Okay.
We have time for one last question, maybe Imam Fahmy was the last.
Well, then take the other one.
No, go ahead.
Mine's just to fill in the blank. You had mentioned something about the Masail needs to be ancient, but the blank needs to be modern.
Arguments. The arguments.
The arguments
Yes.
must be modern.
Modern, yes. The defenses. So the defense and the justification and the reasoning must be new. So he said that because he believes that these questions are all very similar. What's the name? But you might need a new kind of argument to justify your position. Thank you.